You are listening to Verb a Minute, where words do remain.
Welcome to another episode of the podcast series Right the Wrongs. Every Wednesday and Friday, Right the Wrongs raises public awareness on pressing human rights issues and creates an incubator of activism. Today, we will be dissecting the concept of human rights in itself and the possible problems faced with their implementation by various bodies, both national and international. First, let us quickly go over where the concept of human rights comes from. In fact, this can be traced far back to the year 1215, when the Magna Carta prescribed ancient rights of Englishmen. This, however, was just for Englishmen and was in no way universal, like the rights we know today. The concept grew and was championed by many thinkers and leaders over the years, especially from the Enlightenment era onwards, including John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Olympe de Gouges, who championed early women's rights movements in France, or even events such as the Haitian Revolution. This went on after World War II, when calls for open diplomacy and multilateral agreements that are formally organized in an international institution to guarantee collective peace finally began to emerge. This was mostly manifested in the famed Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, where human rights were pushed to be a fundamental purpose of the United Nations. There are many different treaties put in place over the years with several powerful regional human rights regimes, such as the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in 1981, the European Convention on Human Rights in 1953, as well as global declarations of women's rights, children's rights, indigenous people's rights, and draft declarations of environmental human rights. However, we are still seeing injustices every day, from Myanmar to China to Syria, and even in Western democracies, the supposed championers of human rights. So how can we explain this? To start, let us define human rights as rights to which people are entitled by virtue of being human, universal and fundamental rights. They are universal, fundamental, indivisible, and absolute. While this is a noble concept that definitely has served many across the world, it does come with its share of problems. The first of these problems is that of the hypertrophy of human rights. To give a clearer picture of what this means, here's a gripping statistic. The number of human rights increased from 20 in 1975 to 100 in 1980 to 175 in 1990 to 300 today. This ever-increasing number of human rights makes it practically very difficult for states to comply with, especially since the sheer number makes some of these rights seem almost at odds with each other. This leads us to the trade-off problem. Since there are so many human rights, some even conflicting, countries and groups have to select the rights they care most about to enforce. And it's hard to pick and choose because of financial reasons sometimes. So, for example, the trade-off between allocating money to schools or to better social security programs. What's more, treaties provide no guidance as to how exactly these resources should be allocated. One example of this is the organization Human Rights Watch, which disregards economic, social, and cultural rights not because they are intrinsically unimportant, but because Human Rights Watch can provoke a greater public reaction when it identifies specific abusers and victims. According to Kenneth Roth, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, it is hard to blame anyone in particular for poverty, but it is possible to blame government officials for torture and disappearances, which is why they are more focused on. Another compelling example is the case of China, which argues for the right to development as a right they believe they deserve. This does come at a trade-off, though, with some other human rights, since they argue that these interfere with the ability of poor countries to grow economically and eliminate poverty. So China basically argues that if it granted the political rights in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to its citizens, then political turmoil would result, including possibly civil war, with the outcome that economic growth would stop and poverty would advance. So they argue that human rights should still be respected, just not by a state actor. These are just a couple of ways in which the discourse on human rights faces practical obstacles. Now, what about its implementation? Who enforces these rights, and how much power do they actually have to do so? To start with, enforcers are usually foreigners who do not have much experience within a target state, rendering the enforcement of human rights to be done clumsily and somewhat ignorantly. They can come from international bodies or simply other states, the US being a popular example. A second issue is that enforcing human rights can be highly costly for these enforcers due to their implementation of sanctions. For instance, cutting off trade with a rich country that is undermining human rights would be a large loss for the enforcers. This incentivizes them to not always hold certain states accountable. Another way in which the enforcers may lose by holding human rights abusers accountable is by potentially driving the target state to higher cooperation with the enforcers' rivals. An example is Sudan, who, after being isolated by certain Western countries on the basis of its human rights abuses, strengthened its economic relationship with China and sold its oil to them instead. Having shown these weaknesses, could we even rely on the treaties themselves? In fact, they are non-legally binding and do not create substantial obligations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, at the end of the day, just a declaration. They are actually quite vague because of the difficulty of fitting into diverse contexts and even time periods. A massive framework is needed to amend any of these rights. Human rights bodies cannot condemn specific countries for specific practices, or at least can only do so in limited circumstances and in such a way as to have no legal or political effect. And when they find themselves subject to legally binding orders from international courts, they can always withdraw from jurisdiction. A pertinent example here is the Caribbean. In the 1990s, when international bodies ruled against certain procedures relating to capital punishment in several Caribbean nations that violated the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, these nations withdrew from any treaties and instruments that subjected them to the jurisdiction of international courts, without actually withdrawing from the ICCPR itself. This really shows the weakness of human rights treaties in constraining states when they are not implemented by independent judicial bodies. So to conclude, though the evolution of human rights ideals across the years led to its institutionalization in various international bodies, there are many practical obstacles to this discourse, as well as to its actual implementation. Of course, this leaves us with many open questions on how to solve these issues today. For instance, should human rights be narrowed in order to limit their proliferation, or should it continue including larger and larger sets of interests? And can we use successful examples of enforcement of human rights, like in the case of apartheid South Africa, more generally for other current violations of human rights? Let us know in our discussion forums. That's all for today's episode. This episode was written by Tatiana and Shania, read by Melissa, edited by Lois, with our sound producer Isabella, and brought to you by Right the Wrongs under Verba Manent. Feel free to engage with us anytime on Facebook and Instagram, and join us for further discussions on our Telegram group, or leave us a comment at the verbamanentpodcast@gmail.com. The next episode will air on Friday. You can find the program wherever you find your podcasts, bringing you detailed updates on pressing human rights issues. Till next time, take care.